Bonjour à tous. Aujourd'hui, je vais vous lire un article du New York Times du 29 mars 2025. Opération de la CIA et commando en Ukraine. Pouvons-nous simplement admettre que nous menons cette guerre? Pas de troupes sur le terrain semble être une assurance creuse compte tenu de ce nouveau rapport du New York Times. Donc aujourd'hui, je vais vous lire cet article en 3 parties. Tout d'abord en anglais, la partie 3, c'est parti.
Instead, to verify the intelligence, General Tarnavsky flew reconnaissance drones over the hilltop, which took time. Only then did he order his men to fire. And after the strike, he once again dispatched his drones to confirm the hilltop was indeed clear. Then he ordered his forces into Robertine, which they seized on August 28. The back and forth had cost between 24 and 48 hours, officers estimated. And in that time, south of Robertine, the Russians had begun building new barriers, laying mines, and sending reinforcements to halt Ukrainian progress. The situation was changed completely, General Zabrodsky said. General Aguto yelled at General Tarnavsky, "Press on." But the Ukrainians had to rotate troops from the front lines to the rear, and with only the 7 brigades, they weren't able to bring in new forces fast enough to keep going. The Ukrainian advance, in fact, was slowed by a mix of factors. But in Wiesbaden, the frustrated Americans kept talking about the platoon on the hill. "A damned platoon stopped the counter-offensive," one officer remarked. The Ukrainians would not make it to Melitopol. They would have to scale back their ambitions. Now their objective would be the small occupied city of Tokmak, about halfway to Melitopol, close to critical rail lines and roadways. General Aguto had given the Ukrainians greater autonomy. But now he crafted a detailed artillery plan, Operation Rolling Thunder, that prescribed what the Ukrainians should shoot, with what and in what order, according to US and Ukrainian officials. But General Tarnavsky objected to some targets, insisted on using drones to verify points of interest, and Rolling Thunder rumbled to a halt. Desperate to salvage the counter-offensive, the White House had authorized a secret transport of a small number of cluster warheads with a range of about 100 miles, and General Aguto and General Zabrodsky devised an operation against Russian attack helicopters threatening General Tarnavsky's forces. At least 10 helicopters were destroyed, and the Russians pulled all their aircraft back to Crimea or the mainland. Still, the Ukrainians couldn't advance. The Americans' last-ditch recommendation was to have General Syrsky take over the Tokmak fight. That was rejected. They then proposed that General Sodol send his Marines to Robertine and have them break through the Russian line. But instead General Zaluzhny ordered the Marines to Kherson to open a new front in an operation the Americans counseled was doomed to fail, trying to cross the Dnipro and advance toward Crimea. The Marines made it across the river in early November but ran out of men and ammunition. The counter-offensive was supposed to deliver a knockout blow. Instead, it met an inglorious end. General Syrsky declined to answer questions about his interactions with American generals, but a spokesman for the Ukrainian armed forces said, "We do hope that the time will come, and after the victory of Ukraine, the Ukrainian and American generals you mentioned will perhaps jointly tell us about their working and friendly negotiations during the fighting against Russian aggression." Andriy Yermak, head of the Presidential Office of Ukraine and arguably the country's second most powerful official, told the Times that the counter-offensive had been primarily blunted by the Allies' political hesitation and constant delays in weapons deliveries. But to another senior Ukrainian official, the real reason why we were not successful was because an improper number of forces were assigned to execute the plan. Either way, for the partners, the counter-offensive's devastating outcome left bruised feelings on both sides. The important relationships were maintained, said Ms. Wallander, the Pentagon official. But it was no longer the inspired and trusting brotherhood of 2022 and early 2023. Shortly before Christmas, Mr. Zelensky rode through the Wiesbaden gates for his maiden visit to the secret center of the partnership. Entering the Tony Base auditorium, he was escorted past trophies of shared battle, twisted fragments of Russian vehicles, missiles, and aircraft. When he climbed to the walkway above the former basketball court, as General Zabrodsky had done that first day in 2022, the officers working below burst into applause. Yet the president had not come to Wiesbaden for celebration. In the shadow of the failed counteroffensive, a third, hard wartime winter coming on, the portents had only darkened. To press their new advantage, the Russians were pouring forces into the east. In America, Mr. Trump, a Ukraine skeptic, was mid-political resurrection. Some congressional Republicans were grumbling about cutting off funding. A year ago, the coalition had been talking victory. As 2024 arrived and ground on, the Biden administration would find itself forced to keep crossing its own red line simply to keep the Ukrainians afloat. But first, the immediate business in Wiesbaden. Generals Cavalli and Aguto explained that they saw no plausible path to reclaiming significant territory in 2024. The coalition simply couldn't provide all the equipment for a major counteroffensive. Nor could the Ukrainians build an army big enough to mount one. The Ukrainians would have to temper expectations, focusing on achievable objectives to stay in the fight while building the combat power to potentially mount a counteroffensive in 2025. They would need to erect defensive lines in the east to prevent the Russians from seizing more territory. And they would need to reconstitute existing brigades and fill new ones, which the coalition would help train and equip. Mr. Zelensky voiced his support. Yet the Americans knew he did so grudgingly. Time and again Mr. Zelensky had made it clear that he wanted, and needed, a big win to bolster morale at home and shore up Western support. Just weeks before, the president had instructed General Zaluzhny to push the Russians back to Ukraine's 1991 borders by fall of 2024. The general had then shocked the Americans by presenting a plan to do so that required 5 million shells and 1 million drones. To which General Cavalli had responded, in fluent Russian, from where? Several weeks later, at a meeting in Kiev, the Ukrainian commander had locked General Cavalli in a defense ministry kitchen and, vaping furiously, made one final, futile plea. He was caught between two fires, the first being the president and the second being the partners, said one of his aides. As a compromise, the Americans now presented Mr. Zelensky with what they believed would constitute a statement victory, a bombing campaign, using long-range missiles and drones, to force the Russians to pull their military infrastructure out of Crimea and back into Russia. It would be code-named Operation Lunar Hail. Until now, the Ukrainians, with help from the CIA and the US and British navies, had used maritime drones, together with long-range British Storm Shadow and French Scalp missiles, to strike the Black Sea Fleet. Wiesbaden's contribution was intelligence. But to prosecute the wider Crimea campaign, the Ukrainians would need far more missiles. They would need hundreds of ATACMS. At the Pentagon, the old cautions hadn't melted away. But after General Aguto briefed Mr. Austin on all that Lunar Hail could achieve, an aide recalled, he said, "Okay, there's a really compelling strategic objective here. It isn't just about striking things." Mr. Zelensky would get his long pine for ATACMS. Even so, one US official said, "We knew that, in his heart of hearts, he still wanted to do something else, something more." General Zabrodsky was in the Wiesbaden Command Center in late January when he received an urgent message and stepped outside. When he returned, gone pale as a ghost, he led General Aguto to a balcony and, pulling on a lucky strike, told him that the Ukrainian leadership struggle had reached its denouement. General Zaluzhny was being fired. The betting was on his rival, General Syrsky, to ascend. The Americans were hardly surprised. They had been hearing ample murmurings of presidential discontent. The Ukrainians would chalk it up to politics, to fear that the widely popular General Zaluzhny might challenge Mr. Zelensky for the presidency. There was also the Stavka meeting, where the president effectively kneecapped General Zaluzhny, and the general's subsequent decision to publish a piece in The Economist declaring the war at a stalemate, the Ukrainians in need of a quantum technological breakthrough. This even as his president was calling for total victory. General Zaluzhny, one American official said, was a dead man walking. General Syrsky's appointment brought hedged relief. The Americans believed they would now have a partner with the president's ear and trust. Decision-making, they hoped, would become more consistent. General Syrsky was also a known commodity. Part of that knowledge, of course, was the memory of 2023, the scar of Bakhmut, the way the general had sometimes spurned their recommendations, even sought to undermine them. Still, Colleagues say Generals Cavalli and Aguto felt they understood his idiosyncrasies, he would at least hear them out, and unlike some commanders, he appreciated and typically trusted the intelligence they provided. For General Zabrodsky, though, the shake-up was a personal blow and a strategic unknown. He considered General Zaluzhny a friend and had given up his parliamentary seat to become his deputy for plans and operations. Soon he would be pushed out of that job and his Wiesbaden role. When General Aguto found out, he called with a standing invitation to his North Carolina beach house. The generals could go sailing. "Maybe in my next life," General Zabrodsky replied. And the changing of the guard came at a particularly uncertain moment for the partnership. Goaded by Mr. Trump, congressional Republicans were holding up $61 billion in new military aid. During the battle for Melitopol, the commander had insisted on using drones to validate every point of interest. Now, with far fewer rockets and shells, commanders along the front adopted the same protocol. Wiesbaden was still churning out points of interest, but the Ukrainians were barely using them. "We don't need this right now," General Zabrodsky told the Americans. The red lines kept moving. There were the ATACMS, which arrived secretly in early spring, so the Russians wouldn't realize Ukraine could now strike across Crimea. And there were the SMEs. Some months earlier, General Aguto had been allowed to send a small team, about a dozen officers, to Kiev, easing the prohibition on American boots on Ukrainian ground. So as not to evoke memories of the American military advisors sent to South Vietnam in the slide to full-scale war, they would be known as subject matter experts. Then, after the Ukrainian leadership shake-up, to build confidence and coordination, the administration more than tripled the number of officers in Kiev, to about 3 dozen. They could now plainly be called advisors, though they would still be confined to the Kiev area. Perhaps the hardest red line, though, was the Russian border. Soon that line, too, would be redrawn. In April, the financing logjam was finally cleared, and 180 more ATACMS, dozens of armored vehicles and 85,155mm shells started flowing in from Poland. Coalition intelligence, though, was detecting another sort of movement, components of a new Russian formation, the 44th Army Corps, moving toward Belgorod, just north of the Ukrainian border. The Russians, seeing a limited window as the Ukrainians waited to have the American aid in hand, were preparing to open a new front in northern Ukraine. The Ukrainians believed the Russians hoped to reach a major road ringing Kharkiv, which would allow them to bombard the city, the country's second largest, with artillery fire, and threaten the lives of more than 1 million people. The Russian offensive exposed a fundamental asymmetry. The Russians could support their troops with artillery from just across the border. The Ukrainians couldn't shoot back using American equipment or intelligence. Yet with peril came opportunity. The Russians were complacent about security, believing the Americans would never let the Ukrainians fire into Russia. Entire units and their equipment were sitting unsheltered, largely undefended, in open fields. The Ukrainians asked for permission to use US-supplied weapons across the border. What's more, Generals Cavalli and Aguto proposed that Wiesbaden help guide those strikes, as it did across Ukraine and in Crimea, providing points of interest and precision coordinates. The White House was still debating these questions when, on May 10, the Russians attacked. This became the moment the Biden administration changed the rules of the game. Generals Cavalli and Aguto were tasked with creating an ops box, a zone on Russian soil in which the Ukrainians could fire US-supplied weapons and Wiesbaden could support their strikes. At first they advocated an expansive box, to encompass a concomitant threat, the glide bombs, crude Soviet-era bombs transformed into precision weapons with wings and fins, that were raining terror on Kharkiv. A box extending about 190 miles would let the Ukrainians use their new ATACMS to hit glide bomb fields and other targets deep inside Russia. But Mr. Austin saw this as mission creep. He did not want to divert ATACMS from lunar hail. Instead, the generals were instructed to draw up 2 options, one extending about 50 miles into Russia, standard HIMARS range, and one nearly twice as deep. Ultimately, against the general's recommendation, Mr. Biden and his advisors chose the most limited option, but to protect the city of Sumy as well as Kharkiv, it followed most of the country's northern border, encompassing an area almost as large as New Jersey. The CIA was also authorized to send officers to the Kharkiv region to assist their Ukrainian counterparts with operations inside the box. The box went live at the end of May. The Russians were caught unawares, with Wiesbaden's points of interest and coordinates, as well as the Ukrainians' own intelligence. HIMARS strikes into the ops box helped defend Kharkiv. The Russians suffered some of their heaviest casualties of the war. The unthinkable had become real. The United States was now woven into the killing of Russian soldiers on sovereign Russian soil. Summer 2024, Ukraine's armies in the north and east were stretched dangerously thin. Still, General SYRSKY kept telling the Americans, "I need a win." A foreshadowing had come back in March, when the Americans discovered that Ukraine's military intelligence agency, the HUR, was furtively planning a ground operation into southwest Russia. The CIA station chief in Kiev confronted the HUR commander, General Kirilo Budanov. If he crossed into Russia, he would do so without American weapons or intelligence support. He did, only to be forced back. At moments like these, Biden administration officials would joke bitterly that they knew more about what the Russians were planning by spying on them than about what their Ukrainian partners were planning. To the Ukrainians, though, "Don't ask, don't tell," was better than "ask and stop," explained Lieutenant General Valery Kondratyuk, a former Ukrainian military intelligence commander. He added, "We are allies, but we have different goals. We protect our country, and you protect your phantom fears from the Cold War." In August in Wiesbaden, General Aguto's tour was coming to its scheduled end. He left on the 9th. The same day, the Ukrainians dropped a cryptic reference to something happening in the north. On August 10th, the CIA station chief left, too, for a job at headquarters. In the churn of command, General SYRSKY made his move, sending troops across the southwest Russian border, into the region of Kursk. For the Americans, the incursion's unfolding was a significant breach of trust. It wasn't just that the Ukrainians had again kept them in the dark, they had secretly crossed a mutually agreed-upon line, taking coalition-supplied equipment into Russian territory encompassed by the ops box, in violation of rules laid down when it was created. The box had been established to prevent a humanitarian disaster in Kharkiv, not so the Ukrainians could take advantage of it to seize Russian soil. It wasn't almost blackmail, it was blackmail, a senior Pentagon official said. The Americans could have pulled the plug on the ops box. Yet they knew that to do so, an administration official explained, could lead to a catastrophe. Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk would perish unprotected by HIMARS rockets and US intelligence. Kursk, the Americans concluded, was the win Mr. Zelensky had been hinting at all along. It was also evidence of his calculations. He still spoke of total victory. But one of the operation's goals, he explained to the Americans, was leverage, to capture and hold Russian land that could be traded for Ukrainian land in future negotiations. Provocative operations once forbidden were now permitted. Before General Zabrodsky was sidelined, he and General Aguto had selected the targets for Operation Lunar Hail. The campaign required a degree of hand-holding not seen since General Donohue's day. American and British officers would oversee virtually every aspect of each strike, from determining the coordinates to calculating the missile's flight paths. Of roughly 100 targets across Crimea, the most coveted was the Kerch Strait Bridge, linking the peninsula to the Russian mainland. Mr. Putin saw the bridge as powerful physical proof of Crimea's connection to the motherland. Toppling the Russian president's symbol had, in turn, become the Ukrainian president's obsession. It had also been an American red line. In 2022, the Biden administration prohibited helping the Ukrainians target it. Even the approaches on the Crimean side were to be treated as sovereign Russian territory. Ukrainian intelligence services tried attacking it themselves, causing some damage. But after the partners agreed on Lunar Hail, the White House authorized the military and CIA to secretly work with the Ukrainians and the British on a blueprint of attack to bring the bridge down. Attacks would weaken vulnerable points on the deck, while maritime drones would blow up next to its stanchions. But while the drones were being readied, the Russians hardened their defenses around the stanchions. The Ukrainians proposed attacking with tanks alone. Generals Cavali and Aguto pushed back. Attacks alone wouldn't do the job, the Ukrainians should wait until the drones were ready or call off the strike. In the end, the Americans stood down, and in mid-August, with Wiesbaden's reluctant help, the Ukrainians fired a volley of attacks at the bridge. It did not come tumbling down. The strike left some potholes, which the Russians repaired, one American official grumbled, adding, "Sometimes they need to try and fail to see that we are right." The Kerch Bridge episode aside, the Lunar Hail collaboration was judged a significant success. Russian warships, aircraft, command posts, weapons depots, and maintenance facilities were destroyed or moved to the mainland to escape the onslaught. For the Biden administration, the failed Kerch attack, together with a scarcity of attacks, reinforced the importance of helping the Ukrainians use their fleet of long-distance attack drones. The main challenge was evading Russian air defenses and pinpointing targets. Long-standing policy barred the CIA from providing intelligence on targets on Russian soil. So the administration would let the CIA request variances, carve-outs authorizing the spy agency to support strikes inside Russia to achieve specific objectives. Intelligence had identified a vast munitions depot in the lakeside town of Toropets, some 290 miles north of the Ukrainian border, that was providing weapons to Russian forces in Kharkiv and Kursk. The administration approved the variants. Toropets would be a test of concept. CIA officers shared intelligence about the depot's munitions and vulnerabilities, as well as Russian defense systems on the way to Toropets. They calculated how many drones the operation would require and charted their circuitous flight paths. On September 18, a large swarm of drones slammed into the munitions depot. The blast, as powerful as a small earthquake, opened a crater the width of a football field. Videos showed immense balls of flame and plumes of smoke rising above the lake. Yet as with the Kerch Bridge operation, the drone collaboration pointed to a strategic dissonance. The Americans argued for concentrating drone strikes on strategically important military targets, the same sort of argument they had made, fruitlessly, about focusing on Melitopol during the 2023 counteroffensive. But the Ukrainians insisted on attacking a wider menu of targets, including oil and gas facilities and politically sensitive sites in and around Moscow, though they would do so without CIA help. Russian public opinion is going to turn on Putin, Mr. Zelensky told the American Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in Kiev in September. "You're wrong. We know the Russians." Mr. Austin and General Cavalier traveled to Kiev in October. Year by year, the Biden administration had provided the Ukrainians with an ever more sophisticated arsenal of weaponry, had crossed so many of its red lines. Still, the defense secretary and the general were worrying about the message written in the weakening situation on the ground. The Russians had been making slow but steady progress against depleted Ukrainian forces in the east, toward the city of Pokrovsk, their big target, one American official called it. They were also clawing back some territory in Kursk. Yes, the Russians' casualties had spiked to between 1,000 and 1,500 a day. But still they kept coming. Mr. Austin would later recount how he contemplated this manpower mismatch as he looked out the window of his armored SUV snaking through the Kiev streets. He was struck, he told aides, by the sight of so many men in their 20s, almost none of them in uniform. In a nation at war, he explained, men this age are usually away, in the fight. This was one of the difficult messages the Americans had come to Kiev to deliver, as they laid out what they could and couldn't do for Ukraine in 2025. Mr. Zelensky had already taken a small step, lowering the draft age to 25. Still, the Ukrainians hadn't been able to fill existing brigades, let alone build new ones. Mr. Austin pressed Mr. Zelensky to take the bigger, bolder step and begin drafting 18-year-olds. To which Mr. Zelensky shot back, according to an official who was present, "Why would I draft more people? We don't have any equipment to give them. And your generals are reporting that your units are undermanned," the official recalled Mr. Austin responding. "They don't have enough soldiers for the equipment they have." That was the perennial standoff. In the Ukrainians' view, the Americans weren't willing to do what was necessary to help them prevail. In the Americans' view, the Ukrainians weren't willing to do what was necessary to help themselves prevail. Mr. Zelensky often said, in response to the draft question, that his country was fighting for its future, that 18 to 25-year-olds were the fathers of that future. To one American official, though it's not an existential war if they won't make their people fight. General Baldwin, who early on had crucially helped connect the partners' commanders, had visited Kiev in September 2023. The counteroffensive was stalling, the US elections were on the horizon, and the Ukrainians kept asking about Afghanistan. The Ukrainians, he recalled, were terrified that they, too, would be abandoned. They kept calling, wanting to know if America would stay the course, asking, what will happen if the Republicans win the Congress? What is going to happen if President Trump wins? He always told them to remain encouraged, he said. Still, he added, I had my fingers crossed behind my back, because I really didn't know anymore. Mr. Trump won, and the fear came rushing in. In his last, lame duck weeks, Mr. Biden made a flurry of moves to stay the course, at least for the moment, and shore up his Ukraine project. He crossed his final red line, expanding the ops box to allow attacks and British Storm Shadow strikes into Russia, after North Korea sent thousands of troops to help the Russians dislodge the Ukrainians from Kursk. One of the first US-supported strikes targeted and wounded the North Korean commander, Colonel General Kim Yong-bok, as he met with his Russian counterparts in a command bunker. The administration also authorized Wiesbaden and the CIA to support long-range missile and drone strikes into a section of southern Russia used as a staging area for the assault on Pokrovsk, and allowed the military advisors to leave Kiev for command posts closer to the fighting. In December, General Donahue got his 4th star and returned to Wiesbaden as commander of U.S. Army Europe and Africa. He had been the last American soldier to leave in the chaotic fall of Kabul. Now he would have to navigate the new, unsure future of Ukraine. So much had changed since General Donahue left 2 years before. But when it came to the raw question of territory, not much had changed. In the war's first year, with Wiesbaden's help, the Ukrainians had seized the upper hand, winning back more than half of the land lost after the 2022 invasion. Now, they were fighting over tiny slivers of ground in the east, and in Kursk. One of General Donahue's main objectives in Wiesbaden, according to a Pentagon official, would be to fortify the Brotherhood and breathe new life into the machine, to stem, perhaps even push back, the Russian advance. In the weeks that followed, with Wiesbaden providing points of interest and coordinates, the Russian march toward Pokrovsk would slow, and in some areas in the east, the Ukrainians would make gains. But in southwest Russia, as the Trump administration scaled back support, the Ukrainians would lose most of their bargaining chip, Kursk. In early January, Generals Donahue and Cavalry visited Kiev to meet with General Syrsky and ensure that he agreed on plans to replenish Ukrainian brigades and shore up their lines, the Pentagon official said. From there, they traveled to Ramstein Air Base, where they met Mr. Austin for what would be the final gathering of coalition defense chiefs before everything changed. With the doors closed to the press and public, Mr. Austin's counterparts hailed him as the godfather and architect of the partnership that, for all its broken trust and betrayals, had sustained the Ukrainians' defiance and hope, begun in earnest on that spring day in 2022 when Generals Donahue and Zabrodsky first met in Wiesbaden. Mr. Austin is a solid and stoic block of a man, but as he returned the compliments, his voice caught. Instead of saying farewell, let me say thank you, he said, blinking back tears. And then added, I wish you all success, courage and resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, carry on.